Welcome to Believing the Real, a series of talks on the theology of the real. In this episode, the 8th chapter of Evotrust Theology of the Real, we will sum up what we discussed about the righteous mind by Jonathan Haidt and see how the biological becomes enfolded in mind. In fact, biology is embedded in our destiny, in our visions of the real. Hello, so welcome to another episode of Believing the Real. This is the 8th chapter in the series, and today we will sum up what we learned from Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. The basis of this is that we saw how evolution slowly developing, slowly progressing, ultimately led to the rise of mind. Not mind in the sense of a single mind trapped within a body like some Cartesian idea, but rather mind in a sense of the shared mind of human beings, the mind, the intersubjective mind, the ability of each one of us to become part of a greater whole, to interact with other human beings through so many levels of language, and also to represent reality itself within the matrices of our shared minds, in the sense that when we think in language, when we think in concepts, when we have ideals and theories about the world, these are shared ideals, shared theories, and that is the basis of all human culture and civilization. If we go back to our schematic of the ideal and the real, in fact, what makes us human is our ability to create ideals, to think about reality in a way that summarizes the laws that causes reality to behave, make generalizations about reality, and share those through language, through shared ideas, and so on. And as we will discuss today, in fact, human civilization enfolds the previous layers of evolution, the predation, procreation, parenting, and group existence, and the sociability of the higher primates into a completely new arena, a new vista in which everything goes through the representations of the collective minds of humanity. Because when we have a theory, when we have a belief, it is shared by many people, and this creates the infrastructures of our lives. And this goes to all levels of our existence, in fact, supplanting the biological and embedding it, not supplanting, embedding the biological within the psychological. So in fact, everything that went before us in evolution still exists, but is transformed to a new level because it is now embedded in the psychological, in the symbolic. And we saw this in Haidt, and we'll look at it again. We're going to summarize Haidt today, but this has many, many implications. And the important thing is that we can't really look back onto evolution and say, we are like that, how we are this way or that way, because we are evolving all the time. We are evolving on the level of civilization, which supplants the previous functions of the biological. So everything that we have in common with animalia, everything that is within our biological heritage gets mapped onto this psychological, spiritual, symbolic heritage that is the true heritage of humanity. If you will, we can maybe liken this to hardware and software. Evolution evolves the hardware, And on top of that, the software plays around with the hardware, and the software is the developing mind, which also develops, as we saw, through evolution. At some point, mind, the software, overtakes the whole edifice, and in fact dictates everything that can be done with the hardware. The software leads the development of hardware, and we see it today. Everything that is being done in hardware is there to support the software. The software is the actual interface of humans with reality through computers. So I don't like to take parables too far, because we can always err in taking the parable to places that weren't intended from the outset, because computers and machines, they're programmed. So this takes us into another place that removes the creativity that is happening in evolution and in human evolution, in biological evolution and civilizational evolution. But it is obvious, and Haidt outlines for us, that at some point human beings switched from a biological infrastructure to a psychological infrastructure. And that switch, which has many names, intentionality, crossing the Rubicon, Tomasello calls it the ratchet effect, in that it's like it locks some knowledge accumulated in human society, becomes locked. Everything becomes locked within civilization and becomes the basis for the next generation. And of course, today in the internet age, everything that went before us is now being uploaded into the internet and will be forever with us. The internet is forever replicating. There's the internet time machine, everything that went before is there. And there's a lot of enterprises that are digitizing everything into the internet. Many laboratories are working with the internet directly. We know, for example, that the NCBI has this website for all genetic materials. Genetic research done in laboratories all over the world is shared universally. And of course, all past creations of humanity are being uploaded, whether images, books, ideas, films, and it's all the time expanding. All the past is being placed at the disposal of the future, and the present is constantly unfolding and expanding. So what we are today is the result or the consequence of something that began as the shift, the real shift into our human heritage. That shift is the shift into our ability to communicate, to store in language, in symbolic form, and in other forms, the ideas that ultimately we can share with each other. The inter-subjectivity of the human beings, the civilization, the culture, this is the software that makes the human machine, as it were, the human creature function. So as we became human, we stepped up from the primate world and advanced into a completely new world, if you want to call it spiritual, mindful, representative, symbolic, the software, as it were, rather than the hardware. Everything is now working in the software. So all new developments are being carried out through human civilization. All new learning, knowledge, and the lessons we learn from the real are now embedded in civilization. So everything is going faster and faster as we progress at an increasing rate. And of course, today we are actually uprooting the biological and transforming everything into the psychological, the cultural, the sociological. Everything becomes encoded in human software, and nothing of the biological is really allowed to dictate. Indeed, biology is not destiny in the deepest sense of the word. To be human is to carve out a destiny that is not hinged on the biological, even though it may be impacted by the biological, even though our hearts yearn for what the biological has pre-wired us to be, but in fact we are free to rewrite our software, and we are doing it. So now, today, I'm going to sum up Jonathan Haidt, and because Jonathan Haidt, in fact, helps us to view that bridge of transformation from the world of primates to the world of human beings. And he, in fact, shows us the pre-wiring of humanity as it emerged from the biological. As it were, it's the interface between our software and hardware, like the firmware. So we are talking about the firmware here, and that's also, it's also codable, because now with software you can reprogram the firmware, the EEPROM, like reburn it. So we are reburning now our very biological heritage through our very developed civilizational software. So in fact, summing up Haidt, we will look at his 6 bases of human morality once more, and we will see how they pre-wire us for the freedom that we have today, and what is holding us back, let's call it where the limitations of our hardware are, so that we know where we have to invest more in our software so that we can make the most of that hardware, make the most of our human potential to create the new as part of, if we go back to our theology, as part of the divine Evotrust plan, the grand plan. And again, plan is misleading. Plan is the old intelligent design theory, which is completely at odds with what we actually know about reality. So it's actually not a plan. It's a, or let's say, call it an open plan, a constantly developing plan. It's a plan that is always open to change. In the way that we put it here in the Popperian terms, it's always a conjecture about reality, a conjecture about how and what works, and then the real reality itself as it unfolds also through our plans, both successful and botched, because if something evolves humanity, it's humanity evolving itself. We are self-evolving beings, not always intentionally. For example, the terrible atrocities of the 20th century, which was the most extreme human attempt to shape destiny, ended in such a terrible butchering that we took a step back and we're saying, okay, these ideas are wrong. We don't want to, in fact, we don't want to talk about ideas at all. We're throwing out all narratives, which is postmodernity. But in fact, this is all within the narrative, the meta-narrative of modernity. Because were it not for modernity and our faith in our ability to distinguish right and wrong, truth and falsity, the good and the bad, then we would not throw away all those narratives because they are so morally abhorrent to us. For ultimately, as we saw, what really develops here throughout evolution is the evolution of a moral creature, of creatures, beings capable of perceiving other beings and interacting with them in order to create incredible new things in the world, amazingly creative thing through our inter-subjectivity. So this turning to the other, in fact, the invention of the other, because as we saw through evolution, at first there was no other, or maybe there was, like the bonding of molecules is also other, a seeking of the other. But we see so many levels in it. And as mind develops, we are now completely enmeshed within the minds of others. Our minds think with the language that is shared by others. As I talk to you now, in your minds, my words become enmeshed with your ideas, with your visions of reality. And together, we are in fact shaping these thoughts about reality that are now in the world through human interaction. And this goes for every book that you read. All books are forms of telepathy from the mind of the author into the mind of the reader. And suddenly you see the world through the eyes of others. Our ability to do that, to put ourselves in others' shoes, to view others, that is something that developed in evolution. And we are now at the point of history where this has come into its own and has become, in fact, the basis of everything that develops. So let's open our Word document and look at what I took out of Haidt as a summary. Let's summarize Haidt now. Let's see. Right, so summing up Haidt's work, Haidt writes this. My definition of morality, it's on page 163 of The Righteous Mind. My definition of morality was designed to be a descriptive definition. It cannot stand alone, sorry, as a normative definition. As a normative definition, it would give high marks to fascist and communist societies as well as to cults, so long as they achieved high levels of cooperation by creating a shared moral order. So in this short sentence, in which Haidt takes a step back from his own work, we see the very crux of this image, the very essence of what this is all about. Because he says, okay, look, when we look at evolution, we see that people want to follow the leader. They want to subjugate themselves. They want to stick together, even though, not truth, but loyalty. Not morality, but subservience, and so on. All the bases that he talks about, and we'll go into in a few moments. And so he's taking a step back and he says, look, it's just descriptive, it's not normative, i.e., I'm not telling you this as dogma, this is not what the doctrine of how one should behave, I'm just describing, that's the way we are. So let's dissociate, again, biology from destiny. So Haidt is taking a step back now and telling us, okay, don't derive destiny from what I'm telling you about biology. Because if you are going to do that, then you are going to fall into very nasty pieces of work. And the truth is that this illuminates in a fantastic way the defects, the problems that led to the fascist and communist regimes in the previous century. Because in fact, those bases of cohesion between human beings, in which human beings are willing to cover over truth, to turn their backs on equality, on fairness, and so on, for other issues, for feeling united, for obeying the leader, for displaying loyalty, and so on. These things can lead, when they become destiny, when they become embedded in an ideology, they can lead to true atrocities, because they lead to a kind of essentialism of us and them, the very essence of tribalism, of our human bonding, we against them, and the them can be ultimately dehumanized on a scale that is unbelievable. We saw it with the Nazis, the Jews, the Gypsies, everything dehumanized that is not Aryan. And it's all just up there in the air, this Aryanism. All the concepts of race that were debunked in World War II were debunked following this regimes of atrocity that showed us where racism can take us. In the same way, though, the communist thinking about the bourgeoisie, the hounding of small businesses, the hounding of capitalists, which also took an inhuman scale, which took a terrible turn, or the Gang of Four in China, the Cultural Revolution, destroying everything that was old, new, the new generation, the old generation. All these essentialisms, they are part of our human heritage, but when they become the basis of normative theories, they are very destructive. However, because they are part of our heritage, they are always there like sirens, calling Odysseus to jump into the sea. As Erich Fromm wrote about the need for the anatomy of human destructiveness, and many have written about the yearning for a Führer, for a leader, to subsume ourselves, to believe in something greater than ourselves. This is a basic human need, and it's a very positive aspect of being human. So this it's always calling us into this abyss that can give rise to atrocious regimes. So this is very important what Haidt writes here, that we are not talking about normatives, we are talking about descriptive. This is the way we are. It's not the way we should be, because we decide how we should be. We are not slaves to the biological. We shape our destiny. So even though we are biologically pre-wired for all kinds of gender differences, for example, the male is much more aggressive sexually, and so on. All civilizations call upon the male to show restraint. This is about being male. And females, if females are biologically they tend biologically to be mothers, to be nurturing, and so on. Does this mean that they should structure their destiny on their biological pre-wiring? Quite to the contrary. They can choose to be mothers, just as males can choose to pursue their sexual proclivity. And still, this is all in the mind. So because we saw, everything has been shifted into the software. So this is not something that is normative, because norms are given to human beings. This is the description of the wiring, of the pre-wiring. But destiny is up to us. And if we are aware of this, then we can be very careful of that abyss that is calling us, of those sirens of biological evolution that are calling on us to to subscribe to our, let's call it animal natures, to subscribe to our anger or to our appetites and so on, become addicted to them on a level that is turns us away from the sophistication of our humanity, which manages all that within a symbolic regime, while in fact it's not. The truth is that there is no turning back to the biological. Even if a man, for example, eats like a pig, he is not a pig. He is a human being choosing to let certain aspects of his nature overcome himself. But it's a choice. It can never be the pig. The pig has no choice. So everything is woven into civilization. Everything is woven into culture. And indeed, there is no normative to be derived out of evolution, because we determine the normative. There is certainly a trend, a thrust of evolution towards greater care, greater realization of human potential that we should certainly attempt our norms to reflect. Okay, so going back to reading within Haidt, as Haidt wrote, if you would take what he tells you about human evolution and try to make norms out of it, you very quickly get into authoritarian regimes which subsume the individual within them. But Haidt says, I think my definition works well as an adjunct to other normative theories, particularly those that have often had difficulty seeing groups and social facts. Utilitarians in Jeremy Bentham have focused intently on individuals. They try to improve the welfare of society by giving individuals what they want. But a Durkheimian vision of utilitarianism would recognize that human flourishing requires social order and embeddedness. I would begin with the premise that social order is extraordinarily precious and difficult to achieve. A Durkheimian utilitarianism would be open to the possibility that the binding foundations, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, have a crucial role to play in a good society. Okay, so indeed, the question is, what role would they have to play? So we realize that loyalty, authority, and sanctity are the three glues that bind traditional society together. But these glues have glued the human ability to manifest potential together. It's like they glued our fingers together, they glued our lips together. Speak not before authority, speak not against sanctity, breach not loyalty, and so on. Be loyal before you seek truth, even if the one you are loyal to is the head of the mafia. The mafias worldwide cherish loyalty over everything. Being a snitch is the highest transgression, and there's so many movies and so many art dealing with this, the cruelty of punishment to those who breach loyalty to the us, to the we. And of course, authority, respect for authority, respect for what we cherish is at the core of all traditional cultures. And sanctity, that is another, sanctity and authority, I think they are intermixed together, and because the authority is usually sanctified, and what is sacred becomes the authority. I think this distinction is a bit more problematic here, although it is there, because you can say that it's like not just sanctity, it's more like purity versus impurity. So when you say that something is pure, then you want to keep it that way, not unadulterated. And then you hate the impurities. And what is impure is always something metaphysical that is very hard to define. And when you put it on people, then you can easily persecute them and even murder them, because you consider, you hold them as impurities that destroy your purity, your sanctity, and so on. So all these are very dangerous foundations. And by saying, actually, Haidt ultimately remains in a kind of quandary. He contradicts himself. He's saying, look, this is the human, but don't take it normatively. Look, that's how human society is. If we want to be happy, we have to have bond together. But if we bond together too much, then it's going to take away from our individuality. So in fact, he's trying to say, be aware of this and try to step a path that is somewhere in between. But who will give us that criterion? That's not clear. Okay, so going on from this quandary that he finds himself in, but which we, from our perspective of looking at, again, progress and perfection, we can see that, in fact, we can transcend these evolutionary steps in our development as human beings. We can transcend it because we can rewrite our software. So we can relocate the authority in a democracy. We can switch the loyalty to an idea of human rights in the pursuit of happiness, and we can locate sanctity in the God that we trust, or in our case, in Evotrust, the sanctity of life itself, the sanctity of evolution on Earth, the sanctity of human potential, and in fact of every single human being. We can relocate these essential things as we shape our destiny. We don't have to be puppets of this. So let's look at the 6 bases again in summary. And so we have the 6 evolutionary bases that constitute, according to Haidt, the basis of our society, the basis of our civilization as humans, is care versus harm, which is, we think, the very heart of evolution, the idea of caring for others, and even harm is subsumed under that care, because when you harm, it's also a part of the care that you are trying to take of the other, and we try to minimize harm. I think this is the real core of evolutionary progress and the core of morality. As we will see, this is also the core of what Haidt calls the liberal view, and I believe the liberal view is the view that ultimately relies more and more on the software and subsumes within that software everything else, and within it all the other bases. Because all the other bases of liberty, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity can be subsumed under care, ultimately. But I'll talk about that in a moment. In any case, let's look at each and every binary option here that Haidt outlines for us. So if we look at the 6 bases of human morality that Haidt found in evolution, we see that in fact traditional societies have all 6 bases, while more modern societies have fewer bases. And he calls this weird because it sort of deviates from human nature. But in fact, as we saw reading between the lines of Haidt's description, human nature is to be, in many senses, unnatural. Human nature is to make a destiny, not out of biology, but out of civilization, out of what we believe, out of the mindfulness, what our inter-subjective vision of reality leads us to think. This is human nature. So if we continue to subvert our biology even further today, as we undermine these interim developments that were functional for us in the leap from primatehood to humanhood, then all the better. This is becoming even more human, taking these old tendencies that are pre-wired and setting them aside and creating our own destinies. Okay, so what do we have here? What Haidt showed us throughout the righteous mind is that we have a tendency, a pre-wired tendency to preserve our societies. That means if I start from the right and move to the left, that, for example, we have sanctity versus degradation. I think sanctity is not really the proper word here. It should be, because sanctity versus secularism. In Hebrew, it's very clear, this distinction. It's between Kodesh and Chol. It's like sanctity is Kodesh, that's something sacred. It's removed from the secular, and you have the secular. This isn't particularly a negative view of the secular. It's just a very positive view of the of the sacred, of sanctity. But actually, the actual dichotomy here, I think, is purity versus impurity. In Hebrew, purity, ta'ara, versus tum'ah, impurity. And these are essentialist definitions that are very deep in many societies, such as, of course, Hindic societies, do not eat with your left hand, all the impurities that are to do with bodily fluids. In Judaism, there is much to say about this. In particular, historic Judaism, there are huge tractates of halakha dealing with purity and impurity that are not studied today at all, because this was in pre-exilic times. But in any case, the idea of purity versus impurity is still very strong, and we find it even in political theology. Today, there are certain streams in Judaism that speak about us, the pure, versus them, the impure. And of course, on a personal level, you can be pure and impure. There's a lot to say about sexuality here. And these things are very strong in traditional societies, and they become almost completely uprooted in modernity. If there is something that is truly uprooted, it's these things of purity and impurity that in modern times becomes something that is completely relegated to the past. People don't hardly ever think about in these categories anymore at all. And this is something that religion very strongly brings to the fore. If you become religious, immediately these ideas arise. In Judaism, it says the woman brings impurity in red, i.e. menstruation, and the male and the man brings impurity in white, i.e. semen. So once they emerge from the body, they become impure, and everything surrounds this. Don't touch it, organize your life around it, and so on. This is very central to being religious, very central to traditions. And that's the first thing that modernity seems to uproot. So that's one thing. Again, finding the right place for it, because this breeds essentialism. This could be a place, for example, the subjugation of women. Say, okay, a woman is menstruating, then ostracize her from society and so on. This is in many traditional cultures. This is really a very deep part of the culture. The idea of a woman as defiling, as bringing impurity. And of course, this is very subjugating to women. It takes away the human potential, the true freedom of each person to be the utmost that he or she can be. And once you categorize a person into categories of impurity, degradation, and so on, then of course that can bring a lot of coercion. But what Haidt shows us is that we carry it as baggage because this was this is very facile in regulating our societies, saying don't touch that, that's impure, or touch that, that's the pure. That also stratified us. It made us into more organized creatures, these for and against things that purity touches on. So it is part of our heritage, and we should look at it and see how we can incorporate it within our new destiny in the present age. And many people, for example, love the idea of becoming pure, of, say, immersing oneself in purifying water, like the idea of baptism, the idea of mikveh in Judaism. In other religions, this is also the immersion in water as purifying. In Hinduism, they go to the Ganges and so on. There's a lot of this. And this is not something that's bad. If you're not taking it to a place that it ostracizes people and limits them, but only uplifts them, then it can be part of your cultural heritage and tradition. Okay, now let's move to the authority and subversion. Okay, so now we move on to authority subversion. Okay, of course, this is very interesting. Authority subversion is the very essence of the shift from traditional societies to modernity. It is at the very crossroads of science. Galileo subverting the authority of the Pope, science subverting the authority of the scripture. Everything about modernity is subversive to traditional societies because it says that the authority does not reside in tradition, in the elders, in a single view, but only in the consensus of the many. And so the tendency to subjugate ourselves to authority, to bend our wills to authority, is part of our human heritage. And we saw that it worked very strongly in the beginning of civilization, and in fact uprooted a prior human heritage, what makes us really human, the egalitarianism that is created by our shared minds, by our inter-subjectivity. So in fact, because as we showed in the previous talk, alpha maleism is in fact a renovated product of the human mind. It's not the same alpha maleism that we find in primate or in mammals in general, but it's something new, this authority subversion that leans or gleans actually from this human tendency, from this ancient tendency to have an alpha male, to have hierarchic societies, but in fact we reconceptualize that as human beings. So authority is very much a part of tradition, and the one who determines the truth, the one who tells what should be, that's the authority, and it can have many implications for it. Weber had a lot to say about it, and even today it's like we are looking for authority. Our whole society is structured around authority. I'll have more to say about that in future, especially the authority of the scientific establishment. We'll have a lot to say about it. Or the shared authority actually of modernity, both in science and academia and in the attempt to create a democracy, a shared authority. But our human tendency, our primate tendency, is in that direction. So this caused us to fall into terrible dictatorships. After, as hunter-gatherers, we were quite okay living in an egalitarian fashion. And hopefully we are moving into the age where we will be able to stave off all dictatorships in which a single individual overcomes the wisdom of the many, and we will maintain our scientific and academic structures, our social structures of civilization that learn from our past mistakes and establish better ways of doing things rather than rely on just the authority of certain persons, certain scriptures, certain theories. In short, we move from dogma, from doctrine to conjecture, so that when you refute our conjectures and we make a better world for ourselves, we are not subverting anything, but rather we are siding with the divine in continuing to rise up along the evolutionary arrow of progression. Okay, so that's the second basis, traditional basis, which we are often up against when there is an argument in our society between traditionalists and modernists, or according to Haidt, between conservatives and liberals and so on. And let's look now at loyalty betrayal. So this is one of the greatest things about groups, the loyalty to the group, the cohesion to the group, that no matter what, we don't care, right or wrong, this is our group. And we find ways, and this is, Haidt shows goes a long way to show us how we find ways to justify ourselves, to justify our loyalties. And this is a kind of mafia idea of the way we behave. Our group is the best. Our group is the one that's in the right. All other groups are in the wrong. If you say even or think even that some group can be in the right, you are disloyal, you are a betrayer, and there is nothing that society hates more than the traitor. In fact, the greatest cruelty we find is not towards the enemy, but towards the traitor. An enemy can be respected because he's the enemy, but a traitor, never. So traitors are the most despised creatures on earth. As we said before, this is a kind of mafia mentality. The snitch is the most hated. The betrayer of our sacred values is the most hated. This idea of loyalty is very, very strong. So now the question is who you are loyal to. Are you loyal to your family? Are you loyal to your dawn? Are you loyal to your nation? Are you loyal to higher ideals such as the human rights, the pursuit of happiness? All men were created equal before God. Are you loyal to that? Indeed, we find that the great religions, when they arose, were very subversive to the loyalties that previous civilizations demanded. And indeed, the Romans against the Christians, that was their main lament, that people are absorbed by this religion, they become loyal to a higher God and do not obey the laws properly. Ultimately they co-opted everything into the laws, so they organized their little theocracy there in Rome, but we'll go into that some other time. But in any case, obviously this is a very strong basis in all traditional societies. Of course, in Chinese societies, in Hindu societies, the clannishness, the feeling that you are loyal to who you are part of the group. This is a very strong drive, and betrayal can be conceived of as almost anything that veers from the group's regular traditions. Anything can be a betrayal, especially if it's formulated in as part of a doctrine. For example, if you do not keep the group's way of life, then you are a betrayer, and so on. This can become a very powerful element of maintaining cohesiveness in the group. So again, this is something that modernity subverts. Okay, now the other three bases, they are more common in modernity. That's why Haidt also gave us that little gap in the middle, because fairness, cheating, liberty, oppression, and care, harm are things that become more and more prominent in modern society. Fairness, cheating, of course, we find in traditional societies as well, but it is more of an eschatological type of fairness, cheating, because you can postpone the justice of fairness to another world. God will give you your just results. Karma, what goes around comes around. Karma will give you your just deserts. Cheaters will be persecuted, if not in this world, then in the next. If not in this incarnation, then in the next, and so on. So again, this is very strong in the great religions, and it allows, in fact, many bullies to continue to exist in society with impunity, in fact, because, so you can't overcome them now in the next world. So, and this is something that in modernity becomes much more poignant. You're not putting it off. You don't want people to cheat. You want people to be fair. Things should be spread fairly. And this is part of modernity, indeed. The equal right to pursue happiness. But we find it also in traditional cultures, but as I said, less in relation to the real, more in relation to the ideal. There is an ideal of fairness, and God will give you your just desserts in the final days before, when you stand before the heavenly tribunal, the day of judgment. Then all your sins will be brought, all your merits will be brought and weighed in the balance, and you will be judged fairly by God. God is the ultimate fair arbitrator of fairness, and any unfairness you see, many theologies have explanations for them. This is just, there's a lot to be said about it, but it's important to see here that this is a very traditional basis when it's divorced from reality. When it's not a turn to the real, we want justice now, we want fairness now, we want laws that organize and allow people to be fair with each other, economic fairness and other types of fairness, then it can be subverted or subsumed within traditional societies to create a society that is unfair in practice, but fair in the ideal. Because according to the ideal, Plato's republic is fair, because you place the philosophers at the top and the women and slaves at the bottom and so on. But obviously, when we look at it, we see that it is completely unfair, because so many human beings are deprived and dispossessed of their heritage. So fairness cheating, when embedded within ideals, within doctrines, within dogma, can become quite unfair when you look at it from the point of view of modernity. Okay, so we move to liberty oppression. Again, liberty oppression of who? So if it's let my people go, you have to be part of the people. So all the basis of loyalty, authority, sanctity work together to bring people together in their striving for liberty. So you ask liberty not for the individual, but for the nation. And we have seen throughout history that people are willing to give their lives for the liberation of their nation. Even today, when young people go to armies to defend their countries, defend their nations, the idea they have is that they are liberated from external oppression. They may be subject to all the internal oppressions of societies, all the oppressions of traditional societies, but they feel that at least they are free from the oppression of another nation, of those who are not like us, who are outside our ken, our cognizance of who we are. So liberty oppression is also does not always work on the level of an individual. It can certainly work on the level of a civilization, on the level of a nation, and so on. And then it does little for the freedom of the individual. You can be part of a nation that has liberated itself from all oppressors, but is in fact a dictatorship that is completely oppressive to the people. So this tendency that Haidt illuminates as part of our social cohesion, that we as a group want to be liberated as a people, it doesn't always resonate with what's happening in modernity when we speak more about the liberty of the individual and oppression of individuals in the name of all kinds of dogma, all kinds of doctrines. So it seems the same, but it's not the same. It may be where you can speak of liberty in traditional terms, and it will be very non-liberating for, say, the women in the group. It turns out that you are asking actually for the liberty that will be assured the nation as an abstract concept, but not assured the individuals. So when we talk about the abstract, and always, as we said, the abstract is what makes us human. When we talk about ideals, about dogmas, and about doctrines, then we have to look very carefully at traditional dogmas and doctrines that are not always conducive to the liberty of individuals. And at last, we come to the last rubric here of care-harm. So, as we said many times, or a few times, the care-harm point is really the heart of evolution, the heart of modernity. Love thy neighbor as yourself, the golden rule that we find in all civilizations, all cultures. Care for others. That's the essence of humanity, the turn of the other, the rise of the other. That's what made us human, the ability to perceive others, to represent others in our mind, and through that we care for them because we empathize with them, we think the same, and etc. So this, it cuts across all traditions, and at the same time it's also the basis of modernity. So, but in modernity it becomes much more expanded, because now we are thinking about care of everyone that is human, and also not just human, care of animals, care of all life, of Earth. The care element becomes incredibly intensified in modernity after the atrocities of mid 20th century. We place care above all else. Don't talk to me about race. Don't talk to me about gender. Everyone should have a place under the sun. Everyone should be cared for. We don't want all these, in the name of all kinds of ideals, all this destruction. So care becomes the main ideal. And indeed, now we can go and look at the divisions that Haidt created here. So at first he speaks about the liberal moral matrix, and as we said, most sacred value, care for victims of oppression. So I think he's mixing here both care and oppression. So oppression in the sense, as we said before, oppression in the sense of the individual is more aligned with our love thy neighbor, is like don't oppress people from expressing their full potential. Don't oppress women from carrying out their humanity. Don't oppress people because of race. Don't oppress people because they come from a poor country, and so on. So this becomes part of the care idea of care of the individual, the expansion of our thought about individuals, where all other bases can be perceived as upholding society. It is only the care-harm foundation that goes back to the individual within society and tries to find a place for each and every one of us. So he calls it the moral matrix of American liberals, but in fact we can say that this is the moral matrix of modernity. This is the moral matrix that is slowly overcoming the whole of civilizations. This is the essence of modernity. And because Haidt took a kind of moralistic conservative trend, we will see in a moment his analysis of other visions of American factions, then this sort of takes him away from realizing the depth of this, that this is not just something American, this is something that is modern, that this is something that follows science, that follows the great social upheavals that we have seen in our times. It's the moral that we drew from atrocities that were done in the name of other types of moralities, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and so on, these characterized the great fascist regimes. So we're not going to belittle these ideas, but certainly they can be very destructive if they are not construed within a care, again, and versus harm moral matrix. So ultimately, what Haidt calls here the American liberal point of view, I would like to call the evolutionarily progressive point of view, and also the current civilizational point of view, the way in which we are moving now in modernity, in late modernity, whatever, where we are all connected and we are all thinking all the time about the individual, in the full realization of individual potential. So let's look at the other matrices. Okay, now the social conservative moral matrix, most sacred value, preserve the institutions and traditions that sustain a moral community. So this is basically the vision of most religions today. Certainly in Judaism we find it. I think we find it in Catholicism, in Hinduism, in Islam. Basically, keep things as they were. Don't let the world shatter our loyalties. Of course, this is all in modernity. So even when you choose to go in a certain direction and be traditional, you're not really traditional because you are being traditional within a modern world. So it's like a club. You are subject ultimately to the greater trends that are impacting humanity now. But in any case, this is a good description of traditionalist societies, not just American conservatives. You have all these bases that touch upon what kept us together as humans. Again, Haidt shows us that is where you put the carriage before the horse or the horse before the carriage. Because we evolved sociability, we evolved this tendency to think in dichotomies of sanctity, degradation, actually purity, impurity, authority, subversion, loyalty, betrayal. Or since we had this tendency, we grew traditions that involve these things. Ultimately, looking in retrospect from the current position of late modernity, we can see now that all these were also figments of the mind, and we spoke about that. This was also something that developed through the fact that human beings represented each other, represented reality for each other, and these tendencies were very strong binding tendencies that conserved conserved society, but were also very problematic for human potential, for the development of human potential. And ultimately, this is what's happening now, that modernity is allowing for the first time in history that human potential to really find its footing. So we can only look at this picture and say that it's a matter of choice, and that certainly within a care harm or a more modernist view, we can have all this. One can easily feel that one is loyal at certain levels to one's civilization and culture, but that loyalty doesn't trump the loyalty to the idea that one should care for all people, or you can accept the authority of someone you respect and admire, say a great rabbi or a scientist or whoever, but you do not have to take that authority on trust the whole way and subvert your own idea of truth. You can certainly accept it into a wider perspective of who you are and where you are within present reality. I'll have more to talk about that, to say about that in future when we go into more into the psychology of the individual. But anyway, sanctity or purity, impurity, that's also something that one can practice as part of a lifestyle, immersing oneself in sacred waters and so on. So long as you don't categorize people by it, then that's fine. So we can draw on traditional ideas, traditional visions, but it's all within a new matrix of looking at humanity that abhors degrading other people, oppressing them, betraying their humanity, and so on, harming their humanity. Okay, libertarian. Okay, so I think this is more like Haidt's thing. He says that libertarians are against liberty or oppression. They want freedom of the individual over harm. They don't really care if harm is caused. I'm not sure this is true. I'm not sure this is right. I think they do care, not in the sense that perhaps socialists care. They don't want the care of socialism to override the freedom of people to pursue their own happiness. But it takes place on a different continuum than the way Haidt places it. I won't go into that now, but as you see, again, it's more about freedom to be who you are, more freedom on an individual level. Libertarians certainly don't speak about let my people go. They speak about let the individual do his thing, which is something else. Again, within an individual context, I think Haidt here mixes things, obfuscates certain things. Anyway, let's wrap this up. The last paragraphs of Haidt. Morality binds and blinds. This is not just something that happens to people on the other side. We all get sucked into tribal moral communities. We circle around sacred values and then share post hoc arguments about why we are so right and they are so wrong. We think the other side is blind to truth, reason, science, and common sense, but in fact, everyone goes blind when talking about their sacred objects. So, reading this book, thinking about these things can take the blindfold from our eyes. We begin to realize that indeed we should respect others, we should look more deeply into other views, and so on. And again, this is the rise of the real, the rise of science. We can say about academia that the whole enterprise is trying to get to the truth, despite our tendency to for bias. So we have a confirmation bias, but when we realize it, we go with Popper for our refutations and we respect our doubts. Okay, a parting shot. If you want to understand another group, follow the sacredness. As a first step, think about the 6 moral foundations and try to figure out which one or two. This is all I'm reading from Haidt, the end of his book. Which one or two are carrying the most weight in a particular controversy. If you really want to open your mind, open your heart first. If you can have at least one friendly interaction with a member of the other group, you'll find it far easier to listen to what they're saying and maybe even see a controversial issue in a new light. You may not agree, but you'll probably shift from Manichaean disagreement to a more respectful and constructive yin-yang disagreement. Okay, this is all fair and well. Of course, this is within the rubric of respecting others, respecting other views. It's a bit postmodernist. It doesn't matter what the other view is, as long as you open your heart and your mind to it. Again, it sort of turns away from the truth. It says that if somebody's arguing about true, not true, right, wrong, then it would be Manichaean. I'm not sure it's Manichaean. I think everybody reaches very strong conclusions about certain things. Certainly, as I keep saying, the atrocities of the last generation taught us that some things are wrong and we want to move away from them. So indeed, we want a better world, this is true for us. When the other group, even though we understand it, when we see the other group, for example, oppressing women or rejecting people because of their race, we want to go into an argument with them. We want to show them that this is not the right path to take, that it is destructive. So even though our minds and hearts are open to understand traditions, to understand the way things operate, we may not agree, not as a Manichaean disagreement, and not even a yin-yang disagreement, but actually we go back to our essential disagreement, our evolutionary disagreement, and thus we end Haidt. I'll go back to the classic slide that I'm using here. So what is our disagreement? We are saying everything that's happening to humanity is part of the divine. This is our divine nature, that we will ever progress. We will find the true way to move forward, the good way, the right way. And this cannot go through dogma, but only through the realization of our limitations, that we can only conjecture about truth, and let reality refute these truths. Let reality teach us. And when we look at traditional societies, we see all these bases that Haidt has showed us. We see the way that they have grown from our evolution. They are grown from the biological evolution, but we also see the thrust of where it's going, the thrust of progress, more freedom, more care, more feeling empathy with other people, and expanding the other to include all others, regardless of race, gender, nationality, etc., etc. And this is the point that our future talks will speak about, the way this is already happening in our times, in our age, and we will see how we are outgrowing or reframing all these evolutionary pre-wirings that Haidt has shown for us. So, okay, if you've been with me throughout these talks, then I'd like to thank Jonathan Haidt, the righteous mind that was with us for I think the last 4 talks, and he was so conducive to our discussion, illuminating, and we will now move on to other things. We will ultimately speak about the basis, the implications of all that. We will now speak about knowledge and belief, science and academia. We'll speak about money as the way that people interact. Of course, gender, sex, we can't leave that out of our discussions. So we will see everything that is happening to us as humanity moves forward in its evolutionary progress, in its divine evolutionary mission, as it were.